questions were regarding the quotations. There was one with a quotation from Aristotle. There was one with a quotation from B.F. Skinner, the psychologist. And there was another one with a quotation, I'm forgetting it now. But I've thought about these, and they really are hard, and I think we should try them towards the end of the semester, because it's very rare that you would ever be asked in ordinary life to figure out the logic of B.F. Skinner, who's speaking in 1940 and whose argument is barely even comprehensible anyway. So I think Vaughn is just trying to be, I don't know, thorough. We're going to skip those because even though I could do them, it's not going to make practical sense for you, right? You don't need to know how to do that. If you want to, you can do it as extra credit. Okay, so that's what I have to say about those. Anybody who gets those counted off on their homeworks, I will give you credit back for those. Oh yeah, so, yeah. Okay. Another one I got a lot of questions on was Joe's. This is the one that says, Joe says the food in this restaurant is first rate, so it's first rate. It sounds to me like they're trying to do a way one style argument, which would probably mean it's invalid, because premise one would be Joe says the food in this restaurant is first rate, and then the conclusion is so it's first rate. You really need an implied premise there, which is that everything Joe says is true, or Joe is always right about restaurants, or something like that blanket. If you wanted to move it to an inductive strong argument, what you would do is you might still want to add a premise, but the implied premise might be something like Joe hasn't been wrong about the restaurants that he's reviewed ever, like, or something along those lines, that like, according to my own personal taste, Joe has them and he's never been wrong, something like that. That would make it stronger. The way it stands, it might just make it inductive weak as it stands. So inductive weak, why? Because we don't know who Joe is. How do we know that Joe, just because Joe says something, it's true? There's absolutely no reason for us to believe that. So don't think, well, maybe if I had this friend, Joe. No, that's not what they wrote in the argument. All they wrote was, and we don't have access to their thoughts, we just have a book. All they wrote was, Joe says this restaurant's great, therefore it is great. That's bad logic. That's a bad argument. Even if the premise was true, doesn't make the conclusion more likely to be true unless you add extra information. Now, it is true that when we're trying to apply the principle of charity, we may add an implied premise. But like I said, if you add the most obvious one to make the argument valid, it ends up being invalid, because just because everything Joe, well, yeah, everything is Joe says, sorry, it doesn't make the argument invalid, it would make it unsound. If you put in everything Joe says is true as a second premise, then it would make it unsound. So if it's valid, it's unsound. And if it's inductive, it's weak. We can think of ways of strengthening it via inductive principle of charity. Okay, I hope that made sense to you. I'll move on to the next one. Oh, it's about Joe. I was wondering because the question does not state that Joe has any knowledge of the food and is just saying that it's first rate. Would that make the argument weak? Yes, it would make it weak. Or do we assume he has the information to make that statement? No, we don't assume that. Not in a test question like this. If this question appeared on the LSAT, I would say inductive, weak. The only other choice you would have is deductive, invalid. They would make it clearer than this, though. More on quotations. One of them is, in the actual living of life, there is no logic, for life is superior to logic. Another one was, good sense of all things in the world is the most equally distributed. That one. Both of those are, I can do them for you, but let's reserve it for people who want it for extra credit, right? Or who already understand everything else, because those are really bad arguments and they're written in archaic language. So that's another one for the quotations. To answer the question, you must first identify if the argument is inductive or deductive, and I am having trouble doing that. For example, on page 63, 3.3, number 1. And what I'm going to say here is, I'm going to answer your statement with a question, which is, do you understand the difference between way 1 and way 2? And how it's about truth preservation, and whether the truth preservation in way 1 is intended to be flawless, no exceptions, and the truth bind between the truth preservation between the premises and the conclusion in way 2 is likely or probable, not flawless, not no exceptions. I'm going to just go ahead and say that page 64, 3.3, number 21, with the probably, is inductive, because I'm hoping they're not just trying to trick us and it's just, yeah. I'll come back to some of those. Questions about sound and unsound. The word sound only pertains to way 1 arguments. That's only a term used to describe way 1 arguments that are valid, that are logically flawless. And then, since the last step is checking to see if the premises are true, if the premises are actually true, then it's sound. So sound just means deductively valid with true premises. The true premises is the soundness part. Okay? How can I tell the difference between an argument that is deductively valid and inductively strong? Well, deductively valid would mean if the premises were true, there is no possible way in which the conclusion could be false. So you would want to try that counterexample method to figure that out. If there is a way for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, then I would say, depending on the argument, because it is a matter of context, but then it's going to be inductively strong. So if the person who authored the argument intended it to be deductively valid and it makes it, then that's fine. If it doesn't make it, or if they intended it to only be very likely that the conclusion is true, then the induction is strong. The easiest way to think about premises is one thought, one premise. Remember, a premise has to be either true or false. So if it's a run-on sentence, or if it has two totally different sentences in it, then it's probably two totally different premises. But I like to think one thought, one premise. There are questions about implied premises, and we will get to them later on, but page 65, 3.4, part 2, number 1. 65, 3.4, part 2, number 1. The question is, what premise could be added to make the current argument a strong argument? And I put, here's a premise. Any party that is more articulate about policies and more realistic about world events will win the election. That makes it strong. Other people having problems finding an implicit premise to make the argument valid. How can I tell right away which is the one is the implicit premise to make the argument valid? That's what you need to figure out, okay? There might not just be one sentence that can make the argument valid. There might be quite a few sentences that can make the argument valid. So you need to find one that, if true, would also force, in addition to the other one, the conclusion to be true. What is an easy way to come up with implicit premises? Okay, well, we're going to do a brainstorming assignment in class in the future, and that'll probably get you thinking in creative ways that you will never have a problem again in thinking up implicit premises. Okay, this is about the difference between strong and weak arguments. This person has trouble deciding whether the premises provide enough support to make an argument strong instead of weak. One way to look at it is just think of the premises and the conclusion and ask yourself, or pretend that the premises are in fact true, right? Put yourself in that mindset, and then say to yourself, is this conclusion more likely than not to be true if these premises are true? If it's less likely, then it's weak. If it's more likely, then it's strong. So there's no in between here. If you think it's more likely to be true, and just pretend somebody asked you why. If you have a one-sentence answer that adequately answers that question why, then you have a defense for it's more likely to be true. I'm not going to argue with you about that. So as long as you can think of a one-sentence defense, if somebody asks you, well, why do you think it's more likely to be true? That's good enough, okay? That was another inductively weak or strong. I just went over that. Okay. The quotes, yep, I agree. Those are bullshit questions. How would this argument be strong and not weak? That was on page 64, 3.3, number 21. How would this argument be strong and not weak? It's not inductive, so it doesn't get evaluated that way. And I'm sorry if the instructions made it seem like that you should evaluate it in that way. I will go over those instructions in class next time. Determining stuff from opinions as premises. This was about to the comment, if you go to the party, you're completely nuts. And the use of the word nuts, probably. Isn't that just somebody's opinion? Isn't that just, you know, a turn of phrase? So how could we treat it as a true or false thing? Like, maybe it's not a statement. Lo and behold, it is a statement. It's a statement because there are some situations in which that could be true, and some situations in which that could be false. Almost everything is a statement, except like how things personally sense to you. Like, that thing looks green to me even though it looks blue to you. Even the statement that it looks green to me can be true. Yeah, I'm just gonna get off that train. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but we should talk about this in class. Because the person says, other ones in this section as well have premises that seem like opinions or just completely false. Well, for the most part, if it's not a question and it's not a command, you can usually interpret it as a statement. So, for the most part, just assume that most people are trying to make statements that are declarative, that are either true or false. If it's a statement that can be neither true nor false, that's when you're getting to something that's not a statement. If it's a sentence that can be neither true nor false, that's when you're getting to a sentence that can't be a statement. Okay? That's the way to tell. Opinions can turn out to be true. I'm of the opinion that World War II has already been fought. I hope that's true. 3.3 on page 63. Another one, it seems like an opinion. The conclusion seems like it can be based on premises. So we should talk about that at some point, but in general, opinions can be true or false. So opinions are allowed. I know I said something like chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream as an example of something that's not a statement. But that's because there's no way to get it to be true or false without extra information. So it's not the fact that it's an opinion. It's the fact that it's a statement that can't be rendered true or false, as a matter of fact, because it's probably uncalculable and undefinable. I mean, what does best mean there? You know? So... but bring that up in class if you don't like that answer. Page 64, exercise 3.3, question 15. Bachelors are unmarried, and George acts like he's not married. He's a bachelor for sure. This is a classic case. This should look like a classic case of bad reasoning. You know, obviously bachelors are unmarried. That's a point of definition of bachelor. So that one's obviously true. George acts like he is not married. Let's assume he does act like he's not married. Why would you go from that to him being a bachelor? Right? He acts like he's not married. Why does that mean he's a bachelor? I can think of thousands of situations, I think, in which people might act like they're not married or appear to not be married, but they actually are. So that is invalid to go from he acts like something to being he's definitely that thing. Let's see. And that is invalid. So it is a way one style argument, especially because they put for sure in the conclusion. Okay, quotations. Oh, the other one that a lot of people had problems with, and we agreed this was a tricky one. It is unwise to touch that electrical wire. It might be hot. The premise is definitely that wire might be hot. The conclusion is definitely it is therefore unwise to touch it. I'm going to say this is either invalid, deductive, or maybe we should just go with what Vlada said and strong inductive. I mean, it's really hard to tell here without knowing more information. I'm starting to think this is a bogus question too, meaning it's not put in any way that you could properly inform yourself. We'd like to know what percentages of wires that might be hot are actually hot. And we would have to know that in order to decide if it was strong or weak inductive. So, yeah, throw it out, Vaughn. Yes, in the homework you were supposed to, this is a 3.3 or 3.2, you were supposed to say either valid or invalid, or either strong or weak. They're assuming you've already picked way 1 or way 2. So you only need to have one word as your answer. Get it? If it's deductive, you only pick valid or invalid. If it's inductive, you only pick strong or weak. Okay, so I'm going to cut this off for now. I didn't get to every single one, but almost did. And hopefully that gave you either some food for thought or some further questions, and we can discuss that in class. In general, like I said, this is a skill. It's not a talent. So if you're not doing it right yet, you will get there. And we're going to practice in class and go over them. And in addition to that, I'm going to curve the last homework because I know it was a lot for Chapter 3 and for getting used to those definitions. So, okay, good job so far. Great questions.